Hey everybody. So these next couple slides are going to be discussing the process of fermentation. So this is no longer cellular respiration. This is a different process. So as mentioned earlier, aerobic respiration is a process in which you have oxygen. All right. So that is our cellular respiration. Anaerobic respiration is a situation where we do not have oxygen and therefore cannot do cellular respiration. So what do? Right? Think about it. You're at the gym, you're working out, and maybe you're doing a run. As you run, you're using more and more oxygen, right, in order to do cellular respiration. And eventually you get to that little point where maybe you're working out a little bit too hard. Maybe you're using more oxygen, you're burning more oxygen than you can inhale, right? So does your body just shut down? I hope not. That's kind of scary, right? Your body just drops because you have a little less oxygen than you're used to. Instead, your body's going to switch into another process. This one is known as fermentation. Fermentation is a process in which we can break down food, such as glucose, using in a non-oxygen environment, also known as an anaerobic environment. Keep in mind, this process is not very effective, and way less ATP is actually produced in this process. However, it is a very important process, both in humans as well as other organisms. And depending on where we see fermentation, you might see some differences, right? Some pretty big differences. And we'll talk about those in just a second. So please keep in mind the final electron acceptor in this process is not oxygen because there is no oxygen. This is a process in which we have an anaerobic condition. All right, please keep that in mind. There's two kinds of fermentation we're going to talk about. Humans and then other organisms such as bacteria. So just think about what it feels like when you're working out. Your arms and legs might start to feel heavy. Your muscles start to burn. You're going to lose strength. Breathing increases, so on and so forth. And all of this is because your muscles are no longer doing cellular respiration. Ideally, you will do cellular respiration as long as possible. All you need is two things: oxygen and glucose. Well, when you eat, you store that glucose as glycogen, so you have backups. So all you got to do really is just make sure you're breathing while you're working out. Sometimes you can't get enough oxygen, so your body's backup is fermentation. When you are doing high levels of exercise, you just can't get enough oxygen, and therefore you're going to start to go through fermentation. Another way to look at fermentation is glycolysis, but continually. So as mentioned, glycolysis is in the cytosol of your cells. It does not require oxygen. So in fermentation, you could just keep doing that glycolysis over and over again. You take glucose, you split it in half, you get a little ATP out of it. Is it a lot? No, but it's something. All right, so your body can do that over and over again. One of the byproducts that comes from fermentation is one known as lactic acid. So we call this lactic acid fermentation. So when we do lactic acid fermentation, it's humans. All right, this is something we're going to do, something we're going to see when we are experiencing it. How do you know you're experiencing it? As mentioned earlier, here are the typical symptoms, right? You start to feel a little heavy, you're losing some strength, your muscles start to burn. So we can see fermentation outside of the body as well, which we'll talk about in just a second. Fermentation, again, if you look at this kind of like a flow chart, fermentation is an anaerobic process. So when your body takes in food, it goes through glycolysis first, takes the glucose, cuts it in half, and then it decides, am I going to do fermentation where we don't have oxygen, or are we going to do cellular respiration where we do have oxygen? That's the first step. No oxygen, we're going fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation gets the name because we are producing a substance known as lactic acid. Why are we doing that? Well, think about it. Before, we had glucose and oxygen, right? And we were able to create ATP, water, and CO2. All right, think of it like a math equation. What's 1 plus 1? If you do that out, the answer is always going to be 2. In this case, we're changing the equation. All right, so cellular respiration is simple. It's 1 + 1 = 2. But what if we change one of those numbers? If we change one of the numbers, our product is also going to change. For example, if we change the question from what's 1 + 1 and we change that to what's 1 + 5, now our answer is going to be different. The product is going to be different, right? In this case, we're going to change our product because we're changing what we're putting into the equation. It's no longer 1 + 1. It's no longer glucose and oxygen. Now it's just glucose. We're going to get a different outcome. So in this case, we are going to create something new. We're also going to create lactic acid. Lactic acid is a waste product that is going to build up in our muscles. This is that feeling you get when your muscles start to feel like they're burning. Once oxygen is available, cellular respiration restarts, but lactic acid may remain in the muscle tissue. Depends how much you have too, right? Sometimes it could be removed quickly. Other times it may stay there for a while and you might feel some soreness for a little while. Outside of the body, we can see lactic acid fermentation in other products. We see it in yogurt, cheese, soy. We see it on a whole bunch of different locations, and we could use it in the world. So it's not just something humans experience. We could use lactic acid fermentation for creating numerous foods and for other reasons. However, in some organisms, they also do fermentation, but not lactic acid fermentation. An example of that could be alcohol fermentation. So alcohol fermentation is a process in which organisms break down glucose without oxygen. The difference is they're not creating lactic acid, they're going to create ethanol. Ethanol is an alcohol. You may be most familiar with that in bread or in wine or alcohol. Beer, it's what you find in your alcoholic beverages. So with that said, it's going to give us some bubbling effects. I mean, think about it. There's an organism eating food, right? Think of humans. If we eat food, one of the products of cellular respiration is CO2. When it comes to bacteria or funguses, when they go through fermentation, they also release CO2. So we can see that clearly in bread. In bread, these little microbes are going to start to break down the glucose and release CO2, and we can see that in these little gas bubbles that you see in food. That's why if you cut bread open, you see all those little air pockets. It's not oxygen, it was CO2. And that's also the reason why our bread rises, right? Because all that CO2 is expanding the bread, okay? So why don't you get drunk when you eat bread? That's because most of it escapes the bread before it goes in the oven, or it just burns off while it's in the oven. In alcoholic beverages, same idea, right? You're going to get some bubbly in there. You're going to get some CO2, but you're also going to get ethanol, all right? So you're going to create ethanol in there as well. So these two processes are extremely important. We're going to see alcoholic fermentation as well as lactic acid fermentation. Both processes are going to be without oxygen and, again, are because an organism needs to make energy in the absence of oxygen. If you have any questions on this one, please let me know.